The clinic waiting room was a sea of impatient faces and the constant, rhythmic tapping of feet. Phones buzzed, children whimpered, and the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial lavender. Sarah, a medical assistant in faded blue scrubs, stood at the check-in station. Her badge simply read, "Assistant." A well-dressed man, clutching his elderly father's arm, looked at her with a sharp, dismissive frown. "We'll wait for someone qualified," he snapped, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply nodded and kept writing. But 30 seconds later, she looked at the monitor, then at the patient. Everything was about to change forever. The Metropolitan Internal Medicine Clinic moved at a pace that left no room for error or for ego. Sarah had been there for 6 long years. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a registered nurse. She was a medical assistant, the person who took your height, checked your blood pressure, and asked you if you were allergic to latex before the real medical professionals entered the room. To the patients, she was a gatekeeper at best and a clerk at worst. To the system, she was a logistical necessity, a way to keep the doctors moving through their high-pressure, 15-minute slots. Sarah's world was defined by these small, flickering windows of time. She saw the patients before they had their doctor face on, that mask of stoicism people wear when the person with the stethoscope enters. She saw them when they were still nervous, when they were struggling to get their shoes back on, or when they were whispering terrified secrets to their spouses in the exam room. She was an expert in the unspoken, a translator of the silent language of pain. She noticed the way a man clutched his side while he thought no one was looking. She noticed the slight, rhythmic tremor in a woman's hand as she reached for a pen. She was meticulous to a fault. While others relied solely on the digital readouts of the automated blood pressure cuffs, machines that often averaged out the truth, Sarah often kept her manual sphygmomanometer in her pocket. She knew that machines were programmed for averages, and her patients were rarely average. She followed a system she had built for herself over years of quiet observation. Look at the skin, listen to the breath, watch the gait. She understood that a person's walk said more about their neurological health than a 10-page questionnaire ever could. But the environment was a strict, unforgiving hierarchy. In the clinic, titles were everything. They were the armor people wore. Dr. Vance, the lead physician, was a brilliant man but lived in a world of high-level data and abstract diagnosis. The nurses handled the complex treatments and medications, their movements sharp and efficient. Sarah handled the rooming. She was the one who did the prep work. She was often told to stick to the vitals when she tried to share a subtle observation. "We're on a tight schedule, Sarah," the lead nurse would say, her eyes already on the next chart. "Just get them in the room and move to the next one. Don't overcomplicate the intake." The conflict wasn't just internal to the staff. Patients and their families often viewed her as a secondary character in their own medical drama. They would answer her questions with clipped one-word responses, saving the real information for the doctor. They didn't realize that the 15 minutes Sarah spent with them was often more telling than the 5 minutes the doctor would spend. They didn't see the way she noted the color of their fingernails or the way they winced when they took a deep breath. One afternoon, a colleague, a younger assistant who was just there for the paycheck, whispered to her, "Why do you check the files so many times? Why do you double-check the labs from 3 years ago? You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Sarah. Just do your job, clock out and go home. Nobody's paying you to be a detective." Sarah looked at the thick chart in her hand, the paper frayed at the edges. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she replied quietly, her voice steady. "I'm just trying to make sure I didn't miss the pattern. Diseases don't start with a scream. They start with a whisper." She had a history of finding the things that fell through the cracks of the busy system. Once, it was a subtle skin discoloration on a young girl that everyone assumed was a simple bruise from soccer, but Sarah suspected was an autoimmune flare-up. She had fought to get the labs done, and she had been right. Another time, it was a slight change in a regular patient's speech pattern, a tiny slurring of the letter S that was so subtle his own wife hadn't noticed yet. But memories in a busy clinic are short, and gratitude is a rare currency. Each day, she had to start over, back at the bottom of the ladder, wearing a badge that people used as a reason to look past her. As Act 1 drew to a close, Sarah prepared for the heavy afternoon rush. She felt the familiar exhaustion creeping into her joints, the weight of being a small, invisible part of a massive, unfeeling machine. But she didn't let it slow her down. She sharpened her focus like a blade. She didn't know it yet, but the man who had just dismissed her in the lobby was about to become the reason her entire world would shift. She wasn't just an assistant. She was a sentry standing guard over lives that didn't even know they were in danger. The elderly patient was Mr. Henderson. He had come in for a routine follow-up on his blood pressure medication, a task that should have taken 10 minutes. His son, the well-dressed man who had dismissed Sarah at the front desk, was pacing the small exam room like a caged tiger. He was checking his phone every 30 seconds, clearly annoyed by the delay in his busy schedule. He radiated a sense of self-importance that made the small room feel even smaller. "He's just been a bit tired and dizzy lately," the son said, his eyes fixed on his screen, not looking at Sarah as she prepped the blood pressure cuff. "He's 84. It's expected. It's the heat, probably. Just tell the doctor we need to hurry. I have a flight at 6, and we can't be sitting in a waiting room all day." Sarah ignored the condescending tone. She looked at Mr. Henderson. He was sitting on the edge of the exam table, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He looked tired, yes, but there was something else beneath the surface. His eyes were focused on a random point on the wall, and he seemed to be breathing a little too carefully, like he was afraid that if he took a full breath, something inside him would break. She placed the cuff on his arm. The machine whirred and beeped, a cheerful sound that felt out of place. The screen flashed, 132/78, a perfect reading for a man his age on medication. On paper, Mr. Henderson was the picture of health. "Vitals look good," the son said, catching a glimpse of the screen and standing up to grab his coat. "Great. Can we see Dr. Vance now so we can get out of here?" "I need to check one more thing," Sarah said, her voice calm but immovable. She reached for her manual cuff and her stethoscope. The son sighed loudly, a sound of pure, unadulterated exasperation. "Is this really necessary? The machine just said he's fine. You're an assistant, right? Just follow the protocol, put the numbers in the computer, and let the doctor handle the actual medicine. You're wasting our time." Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have time to argue. She pumped the rubber bulb, listening intently through the earpieces. The karate cough sounds were there, but as the pressure dropped, she noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible skip, a minute irregularity that the digital monitor had smoothed out to provide a clean, normal average. She then reached for his wrist, checking his pulse manually. It was steady in its rhythm, but the volume, the actual strength of the beat against her fingers, was fluctuating ever so slightly with his breathing. This was the danger zone of modern medicine. The moment when a patient looks normal on a screen, but feels wrong to a human touch. She asked Mr. Henderson to track her finger with his eyes. "Just follow the tip of my pen, Mr. Henderson," she said gently. He did so, but there was a micro delay, a split-second lag when his gaze moved to the left. It was so faint that most people would have blamed it on old age, or the dim lighting of the room, or simple fatigue. But Sarah remembered a pattern she had seen years ago in a neuro clinic, a pattern that usually ended in a quiet, sudden, and irreversible collapse. The clinic outside the room was at peak capacity. 2 emergency walk-ins had just arrived, a child with a high fever and an elderly woman with chest pains. Dr. Vance was already 40 minutes behind schedule. The lead nurse was frantically trying to triage the crowded hallway, her face tight with stress. "Sarah, why is Henderson still in the room?" the nurse asked, sticking her head inside. "We have his vitals. Move him to the sub-waiting area. We need this room for a laceration repair. We don't have time for a social visit." Sarah looked at Mr. Henderson, whose face seemed to be growing paler by the minute. She then looked at the nurse. "I'm not moving him yet. I think we need a full neurological check and an immediate EKG. Something isn't right." The nurse's eyes narrowed into slits. "His vitals were stable on the intake sheet, Sarah. What are you seeing that the automated machines aren't? We are drowning out here." "It's not what I'm seeing," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, serious register so as not to alarm the patient. "It's what I'm feeling. His pulse volume is varying with his inspiration. His ocular tracking is lagging significantly on the left. He's not just tired, Brenda. He's compensating for something big. The son stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You're holding up my father's appointment because of a feeling? Who do you think you are? You're a medical assistant. You take the vitals, you don't diagnose. I want the doctor and I want him now. I am not paying for an assistant's intuition. Sarah felt the heat of the embarrassment, the weight of the collective doubt pressing down on her. She was being labeled as difficult. She was overstepping her bounds. The entire system was designed to ignore people like her in favor of the clock. She knew that if she was wrong, her job was over. She would be the assistant who cried wolf and wasted the clinic's precious resources. But then she looked at Mr. Henderson again. As he tried to stand up to follow the nurse's impatient instruction, he swayed. Not a large dramatic movement, just a 2-inch drift to the right. He caught himself on the edge of the exam table, his knuckles turning white. His eyes went wide with a momentary, silent flash of primal fear. He knew. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped between the patient and the door, her posture rigid. He's not leaving this room, she said, and her voice held a new authority. The tone was no longer that of a quiet assistant. It was the tone of a professional who knew exactly what was about to happen. I'm calling a stat consult, right now. The tension in the small, sterile exam room was thick enough to choke on. The nurse looked at Sarah, then at the pale man on the table, indecision finally flickering in her eyes. The hierarchy was being challenged in a way that couldn't be ignored, and in a medical setting, that was a dangerous high-stakes game. Sarah, if you're wrong about this, if we pull Dr. Vance away for nothing, the nurse started, her voice a final warning. I'll take the write-up, I'll take the termination, Sarah interrupted, her eyes never leaving the patient. Just get the EKG and tell Dr. Vance to come to bed 7 immediately. Tell him it's an atypical presentation of a brainstem TIA. Tell him the clinical signs are there, regardless of the monitor. The nurse froze at the sheer specificity of the suggestion. Medical assistants didn't usually use terms like brainstem TIA. She finally moved, her training kicking in, and grabbed the portable EKG machine from the crowded hallway. The son was still fuming, his hands balled into fists, but the sheer intensity in Sarah's voice had finally caused him to fall into an uneasy silence. He watched, confused and defensive, as Sarah began expertly sticking the leads onto his father's chest. Dr. Vance walked into the room 30 seconds later, his coat flapping behind him. He looked annoyed, his brow furrowed. What's the emergency, Brenda? I have a patient with a suspected pulmonary embolism in room 4 who needs my immediate attention. Sarah didn't blink, and she didn't apologize. Mr. Henderson, doctor, digital vitals are 132/78, but his manual pulse volume is erratic. He has a left-sided ocular lag and paradoxical swaying when attempting to stand. I believe he's having an intracranial event that's masking his simple fatigue. The digital monitor is missing the arrhythmia. Dr. Vance looked at the EKG strip as it began to crawl out of the machine. He looked at the jagged waves, then back at the patient. He performed a quick neurological check, the exact same one Sarah had just done. He moved his pen light across Mr. Henderson's pupils. The lag was still there, but this time it was worse. The left pupil was starting to react more slowly than the right. Get the gurney, Dr. Vance said, his voice suddenly losing its annoyance and becoming sharp, cold, and precise. Call the hospital. Tell them we have a suspected basilar artery occlusion in progress. We need a neurointervention team on standby in the ER. Move now! The room erupted into a whirlwind of activity. The quiet clinic was gone, replaced by the focused, high-stakes chaos of a life-saving intervention. The son stood in the corner, his mouth hanging open, his cell phone forgotten on the floor. He watched as the woman he had called unqualified took absolute command of the room, assisting the doctor with the speed and precision of a seasoned veteran. She wasn't just taking notes anymore. She was stabilizing the patient's head, monitoring the heart rate manually every 30 seconds, and reciting a concise, perfect medical history to the paramedics as they burst through the double doors. She was the calm, unshakable center of the storm. As the paramedics wheeled Mr. Henderson out toward the waiting ambulance, Dr. Vance turned to Sarah. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in his career. "How did you catch it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. The monitor said he was stable. The intake sheet was green. I would have walked in there, checked his blood pressure meds, and sent him home in 5 minutes. He would have been dead by dinner. How did you know? Sarah wiped her hands on a sanitizing cloth, her movements methodical. Her hands were finally starting to shake, a delayed reaction to the stress, but her voice remained steady. "The monitor only sees what it's programmed to see, doctor. It doesn't see the way a man holds his breath because he's afraid he'll lose his balance. It doesn't see the fear in the eyes. It doesn't feel the weakness in the pulse. Machines don't have intuition." The son, who was about to follow the paramedics out to the ambulance, stopped at the doorway. He looked at Sarah, and all the arrogance, all the dismissive pride had vanished from his face. He looked humbled and profoundly, deeply ashamed. I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I thought you were just... I'm so sorry. I almost killed my father because of my own ego." Sarah simply nodded, her expression neutral. "Go be with your father. He needs you to be his eyes now. He's lucky we caught it." The truth was finally out in the open. It wasn't about the faded scrubs. It wasn't about the cheap plastic badge that said assistant. It was about the fact that Sarah had chosen to be the one who didn't look away. She was the one who valued the patient over the protocol, the human over the machine. The clinic slowly returned to its frantic pace, but something fundamental had changed in the air. The nurses were talking in hushed, respectful tones. The administrative staff were looking at Sarah differently, as if seeing her for the first time. The hierarchy hadn't disappeared, but it had been cracked wide open. Dr. Vance walked back to his desk, but he stopped and turned around before sitting down. "Sarah?" "Yes, doctor. Tomorrow morning before the shift starts, I want you to sit in on the clinical review with the senior staff. We need to talk about what we're missing in our standard intake procedures. I want your input on how we can train the new staff to actually observe. Your eyes saved a life today. It wasn't a formal promotion. It wasn't a massive raise. But it was something far more valuable in that building. It was the recognition that her title didn't define her expertise or her worth. She had spent years being the unseen observer, and now finally, she was the one being seen. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt like a medical assistant who had done her job properly. But as she sat down to finish her charting for the day, she realized that she would never have to prove herself in that room ever again. The truth didn't need a loud voice or a fancy title. It just needed someone who was willing to listen to the silence and notice the patterns that everyone else was too busy to see. The next morning, the clinic looked exactly the same to any outsider. The same smell of lavender and bleach, the same buzzing phones, the same sea of impatient faces waiting for their names to be called. But for Sarah, the world felt fundamentally different. She walked into the cramped break room to get her first cup of coffee. Brenda, the lead nurse who had tried to move Mr. Henderson out of the room, was already there. She looked up from her mug, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy with the memory of the day before. "He's in stable condition," Brenda said finally, her voice softer than usual. "The neurosurgeon at the hospital called this morning. They caught the clot just in time. He said another 20 minutes and he would have had a massive, life-altering stroke. He called it a miracle catch from the primary clinic." "I'm glad he's okay," Sarah said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Listen," Brenda continued, stirring her sugar. "I'm sorry I doubted you. We get so caught up in the numbers and the rooms and the next, that we forget why we're actually here. You didn't forget. You reminded us that the patient isn't a chart. He's a person." It was a small apology, but in the world of clinical hierarchy, it meant everything. Throughout the day, Sarah noticed other subtle changes. When she brought a patient into a room, the nurses would actually pause and ask her, "Anything I should know?" instead of just grabbing the chart and walking away. When Dr. Vance did his rounds, he would stop to read Sarah's handwritten notes, the ones she scribbled in the margins about a patient's mood or a subtle physical tic. The system was still there, but it was breathing now. It was more human. Sarah found herself back at her small desk at the end of the shift. She pulled out her private notebook, the one where she recorded the patterns she observed in her 6 years at the clinic. She turned to a fresh, white page and wrote, "Patterns matter. The title is just a label on the box. What's inside is what saves the life. Never let the machine tell you what the heart is doing. She realized that the most dangerous thing in medicine wasn't a virus or a blood clot. It was the assumption that you already know everything. It was the arrogance of thinking that a title gives you a monopoly on the truth. As she was leaving the building, she saw a young woman checking in at the front desk. She was wearing the same faded blue scrubs that Sarah wore, her eyes wide with the stress of her first month. She looked exhausted, and she was being ignored by a patient who was busy complaining loudly about the wait time. Sarah walked over and placed a steady hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You see that patient in the corner? The one tapping his foot?" Sarah whispered, pointing to a man who was sitting very still. "Watch his breathing. Don't just look at the digital monitor when you room him. Look at his hands. Trust what your eyes tell you, not just the computer." The young woman looked at Sarah, then at the patient. She nodded slowly, her eyes brightening with a new sense of purpose and validation. Sarah walked out into the cool evening air. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She was a teacher, she was a guardian, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. She hadn't changed the entire world, but she had changed the way one small corner of it looked at the people in blue scrubs. And for Sarah, that was more than enough. She knew that tomorrow there would be more patients, more numbers, and more dismissive glances from people who didn't know better. But she also knew that she would be there, watching, listening, and refusing to ignore the truth. In our modern society, we are obsessed with titles and credentials. We look at the letters after a person's name to decide how much respect they deserve. We look at the uniform or the office size to decide if someone is worth listening to. We have built massive, efficient systems that prioritize hierarchy over humanity and data points over empathy. But as Sarah's story reminds us, the truth doesn't care about your title. A medical assistant can see what a master surgeon misses because they are closer to the patient. A teacher's aide can see the spark in a child that a principal ignores. An intern can see the fatal flaw in a CEO's grand plan because they are looking at the foundation, not the sky. The unseen observers are everywhere around us. They are the people who do the heavy lifting, the people who spend the most time on the front lines, the people who aren't burdened by the heavy ego of a high-ranking position. They are the ones who have the luxury of paying attention to the small, messy things that make us human. In a world that is moving faster and faster, we are losing the ancient art of observation. We rely on data, on sensors, and on automated reports to tell us if we are healthy or successful. We think that if the screen is green, everything is fine. But life is lived in the margins, in the gray areas. Life is found in the lagging eyes and the varying pulse that no machine, no matter how advanced, can ever fully capture. Sarah didn't save Mr. Henderson because she had a PhD or a wall full of awards. She saved him because she chose not to look away when it was easier to do so. She saved him because she had the courage to speak up in a system that was designed to keep her quiet and compliant. This is the lesson for all of us. Respect the person, not just the title they wear. Value the observation, not just the rank of the observer. And never ever assume that someone lower than you has nothing to teach you. The next time you're in a clinic, a school, or a busy office, take a moment to look at the people in the background. Look at the assistants, the clerks, the technicians, and the cleaners. They are the eyes and ears of the world. They are the ones who see the patterns in the noise while the rest of us are looking at our phones. And if you are one of those people, if you feel invisible, if you feel like you are just an assistant in your own life, know this: your value is not found in your title. Your value is in your vision. Your value is in your choice to care when it's easier to just follow the protocol and clock out. Don't let the world dim your focus or silence your voice. Keep watching. Keep listening. Keep being the one who notices the truth in the shadows. Because one day, your feeling, your intuition, will be the only thing standing between someone and the darkness. They said she was just an assistant, but the truth was never in her title. It was in what she chose not to ignore. They said she was just an assistant, but the truth was never in her title. It was in what she chose not to ignore.